What you're watching right now is not a social media tantrum. It's a stress response from a system under threat. A former president doesn't melt down publicly because of noise. He melts down when pressure reaches something he cannot afford to expose. Congress didn't issue a press release. They issued subpoenas, 25 years of financial records, personal, corporate, domestic, foreign. And for the first time, members of Trump's own party helped make it happen. That's the signal most people are missing. If this were just partisan theater, Republicans would have closed ranks. They didn't. They broke. And when power holders break formation, it's usually because the risk of protection has become greater than the risk of truth. So don't get distracted by the insults on Truth Social. Focus on the fear beneath them, because transparency terrifies only one kind of system, the one that cannot survive sunlight. Stay with me. Because to understand why this moment matters, you have to see the structure behind it, not the spectacle. And that's where this story really begins. Let's be precise, because precision is where power shifts. This wasn't a protest vote. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a formal authorization passed 28-14, granting Congress the legal right to seize 25 years of Donald Trump's financial life. Back to the year 2000, personal returns, corporate entities, domestic banks, foreign transactions. And here's the critical point. This vote did not happen in a vacuum. It came after months of quiet preparation, legal vetting, and forensic review. It came after 4 hours of closed-door testimony from accountants whose job is not politics, but pattern recognition. When Republicans joined Democrats, they weren't making a moral statement. They were making a risk calculation. They decided that defending secrecy was more dangerous than exposing it. That's the pivot most headlines miss. Because once secrecy becomes a liability, the entire system flips. To understand why this moment feels different and why Trump's reaction is so revealing, we need to step back and look at how this confrontation was engineered, slowly and deliberately. That story begins long before the vote. This confrontation didn't appear overnight. It was engineered quietly over years. For decades, Donald Trump treated financial opacity as a survival strategy. He fought every request, delayed every disclosure, claimed every inquiry was political. And for a long time, that strategy worked not because the questions lacked merit, but because institutions hesitated. What changed is not Trump. What changed is tolerance. Courts have already forced partial exposure. New York prosecutors pierced the veil. A civil fraud trial documented inflated valuations. His own chief financial officer admitted to systematic tax fraud. Each case stripped away one layer of plausible deniability. Meanwhile, Congress learned from failure. Past attempts were broad, slow, and vulnerable to delay. This time, the committee narrowed scope, fortified legal grounding, and waited. They didn't move until forensic accountants identified discrepancies that couldn't be explained away by accounting noise. And then came the political shift. After leadership chaos and weakening party discipline, Republican lawmakers from competitive districts faced a different reality. Loyalty no longer guaranteed safety. Accountability suddenly offered cover. That's the backdrop. Not a sudden attack, but the closing of a trap. And once a trap is fully set, the smallest movement can trigger it. That movement came next. The room went quiet before it exploded. 4 hours. That's how long members sat behind closed doors listening to forensic accountants walk them through numbers that didn't line up. Valuations that shifted depending on the audience. Assets described one way to banks and another way to tax authorities. This wasn't ideology. It was math. When the vote finally came, it landed with force. 28 in favor, 14 opposed, and 6 Republicans crossing a line Trump assumed was permanent. That's the crisis moment. Because bipartisan subpoenas don't just authorize investigation. They legitimize suspicion. Overnight, the argument that this was a partisan witch hunt collapsed under its own weight. And Trump understood that instantly. Within minutes, he was posting, attacking, naming names, threatening political destruction. Not the behavior of someone confident in their records, but of someone watching control slip away. Here's why that matters. Public outrage can be managed. Legal exposure cannot. Once subpoenas are authorized, delay becomes the only defense left. And delay is not innocence, it's triage. If you think this is just another Trump outburst, you're missing the signal. This was the first visible crack in a wall built to keep one thing hidden. If you're trying to understand power in America, pay attention to moments like this. They tell you where pressure is actually landing. Because what followed wasn't noise, it was excavation. To understand why this is so dangerous for Trump, you have to understand how financial power actually hides. It doesn't hide in one transaction. It hides in patterns. For years, Trump's financial strategy relied on fragmentation. Different valuations for different audiences, separate entities, layered loans, jurisdictions that don't talk to each other. Banks see one version, tax authorities see another, the public sees none. That system works only under one condition. No one ever sees the whole picture. Forensic accounting destroys that advantage. When Congress demands everything returns, banking records, foreign transactions, the fragments collapse into a single timeline. Patterns emerge. Inconsistencies stop looking like mistakes and start looking like intent. This is why Trump has always fought disclosure with such intensity, not because one document is fatal, but because aggregation is a single inflated valuation can be explained. 25 years of them cannot. And here's the structural trap. Congress didn't demand documents blindly. They narrowed scope after legal review. They designed subpoenas to survive court challenges. They targeted exactly the intersections where misrepresentation becomes provable. At that point, secrecy is no longer protection. It's evidence. And once evidence exists, institutions don't need motivation. They need jurisdiction. That's when investigations stop being political and start being procedural. Which brings us to the second surge of pressure where legal theory meets electoral reality. This is where the pressure stops being abstract. Because at this stage, Trump is fighting on two fronts and losing leverage on both. Legally, the exits are closed. He is no longer president. Executive privilege doesn't apply. The subpoenas were narrowed precisely to survive court review. And bipartisan support removes the argument that this is political retaliation. Every legal move left to him serves only one purpose: delay. Politically, delay looks like concealment. While Trump files emergency motions and appeals, he is also running for president. Every court filing becomes a headline. Every delay feeds the same question voters keep asking: what is he hiding? This is the second crisis. Not the subpoenas themselves, but the collision between legal defense and electoral exposure. The more aggressively he fights transparency, the more he undermines his own narrative as a successful businessman with nothing to fear. The optics are brutal. Confidence releases records. Panic hires lawyers. And there's a deeper danger. Once Congress obtains these documents, other institutions don't need to speculate. Prosecutors can refer. Regulators can act. Foreign governments can surface records of their own. This is why the panic is real. Because this time, Trump isn't just resisting investigation, he's racing against time. And time, in systems like this, always favors disclosure. Which brings us to the people caught in the middle, voters who feel the consequences before the verdict ever arrives. Now let's bring this back to you. Because while lawyers argue and politicians posture, you're the one living inside the consequences of a system that either enforces accountability or doesn't. When powerful figures can hide decades of financial dealings, the message is simple. Rules are optional for the connected. And that message doesn't stay at the top. It filters down. It erodes trust. It tells ordinary people that honesty is for those without power. You pay your taxes. You disclose your income. You follow rules you didn't write. So when someone seeking the presidency fights transparency with everything they have, it doesn't just raise legal questions, it raises moral ones. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If Congress backs down here, it signals that intimidation works, that loyalty outweighs duty, that fear beats law, that precedent doesn't just affect Trump, it affects every future leader watching this play out. This is why some Republicans broke ranks, not out of heroism, but self-preservation. Their voters want accountability. They're tired of double standards. If this matters to you, if you believe power should answer to the same rules as everyone else, then pay attention. Share this conversation. Talk about it. Because silence is how systems drift. And what happens next will shape far more than one campaign. This story doesn't stop at America's borders. Because when a former president's finances intersect with foreign entities, the issue stops being political and starts being geopolitical. If Congress uncovers undisclosed transactions involving countries with adversarial relationships to the United States, the implications ripple outward. Allies question judgment, rivals see leverage. Intelligence services reassess vulnerability. Financial opacity is not neutral on the world stage. It's exploitable. Foreign governments don't need compromat handed to them. They build it slowly through loans, partnerships, real estate deals, licensing agreements. When transparency fails, influence fills the gap. That's why this investigation matters beyond domestic politics. Markets react to credibility, diplomacy relies on trust, and leadership depends on the assumption that decisions are made in the national interest, not shaped by undisclosed financial exposure. When that assumption weakens, so does deterrence. And here's the systemic risk. If the United States signals that even former presidents can shield foreign financial entanglements from scrutiny, it sets a precedent every authoritarian regime will cite. Accountability becomes selective. Oversight becomes optional. This isn't about embarrassment. It's about whether democratic systems can defend themselves in an era where money moves faster than law. Which brings us to the unavoidable question. What happens next when this pressure finally resolves? From here, the system has only three possible paths. The first is compliance. Trump releases the records voluntarily or by court order. The documents surface, forensic accountants do their work. If the discrepancies are explainable, the damage is political but finite. Transparency closes the chapter, even if it wounds his image. This is the least destabilizing outcome for institutions and the least likely. The second is prolonged resistance. Trump fights every subpoena, appeals every ruling, delays disclosure through procedural warfare. This keeps uncertainty alive through the election cycle. Legal costs soar. Media scrutiny intensifies. Every week without transparency becomes another data point suggesting concealment. Trust erodes steadily, not with a bang, but with attrition. Then there's the third scenario, the most consequential. The records are produced, and they reveal patterns that trigger cascading investigations. Referrals move to prosecutors. Foreign transactions draw scrutiny. Regulatory agencies act independently. At that point, control shifts permanently from politics to process. And here's the system-level truth. Institutions don't need villains. They need documentation. Once documentation exists, outcomes stop being negotiable. They become mechanical. This is why secrecy is defended so aggressively and why its collapse changes everything. Which path unfolds will determine more than one man's future. It will tell us whether accountability still functions when it's most inconvenient. And that brings us to the final question, what this moment ultimately means. This moment isn't about Donald Trump alone. It's about whether modern democracy can still enforce limits on concentrated power, especially when that power is loud, popular, and relentless. For years, Trump's greatest shield wasn't innocence. It was delay. Delay in courts, delay in Congress, delay in public attention. What changed here is simple and profound. Delay stopped working. When bipartisan subpoenas move forward, when forensic accounting replaces political argument, and when institutions act despite intimidation, the system reasserts itself, not emotionally, mechanically. That's what frightens Trump. Not critics, not headlines, process. Because process doesn't care who you are, it only asks what the documents say. If transparency prevails, this case becomes a warning to future leaders that secrecy has limits. If it fails, it teaches the opposite lesson, that power can outrun accountability. And that choice doesn't belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters who decide what standards they tolerate. So watch what happens next. Watch the courts. Watch the delays. Watch who defends transparency and who attacks it. If you want to understand power in the 21st century, this is the case study. And if you want more analysis like this, calm, structural, and grounded in how systems actually work, stay with this channel. Because the next phase of this story won't be loud. It will be procedural. And that's where outcomes are decided.